Hey there, come a little closer to the fire with me. Tonight I want to tell you a story that begins with something small enough to fit in two hands and ends with a question big enough to keep a whole desert awake. A darker truth, softly spoken, that sometimes the oldest words on earth are not prayers for peace, but careful notes about cities that vanished too quickly to understand. In a museum far from the sands of southern Iraq, there is a clay tablet with a cold catalog number, CBS2204. Its surface is covered in wedge marks, neat as footprints in fresh snow. Those marks describe a storm and a fire, and salt scattered like a thin, pale veil across farmland. They describe heat so brief and intense that mud brick seems to soften, and pottery seems to remember how to become glass. And again, like a quiet bell in the dark, the tablet repeats a phrase that still makes scholars. If that kind of mystery is the sort you like to drift into, please tap like and subscribe. It helps other night wanderers find these stories in the huge digital night, and it lets me keep the fire warm for you. Now, let the room dim a little. Let your eyes soften. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Take a slow breath in and let it out as if you are fogging a mirror. There is no need to hold every detail. You can float. You can blink in and out. The story will stay gentle, and I will keep my voice low, like candlelight on stone. I have always found it strange how the darkest truths arrive in quiet containers, not in shouting, not in bright headlines, but in something you can hold and tilt toward the light. A tablet, a shard, a layer of dust that refuses to be ordinary. If you were standing here with me, we would be in the Babylonian rooms of a museum where the air smells of cooled stone and clean, patient dust. The lights are soft, and the glass cases reflect your face back at you, faintly, like you are already part of the exhibit. Somewhere a guard's shoes squeak, somewhere a door sighs. You lower your voice without being told. Behind the glass, rows of clay tablets sit like closed mouths. CBS2204 is only one of them, but it has a way of drawing the mind closer. It came from the temple library at Nippur, a place that once gathered words the way a river gathers silt. Thousands of tablets were buried there, protected by accident, by collapse, by time itself, until later hands brushed sand away and lifted them into air. The text belongs to a genre scholars call city laments, compositions written to mourn urban centers that were utterly annihilated, not conquered and occupied, not slowly emptied by drought, but struck in a way that left writers reaching for language as carefully as they reached for clay. Some scholars argue these laments are poetry first, theology second, history only in a distant echo. It is debated. We cannot be sure how literal each image is. Ancient people described a disaster with the vocabulary they had, and gods often entered the story when the world broke. Still, there are details that feel less like metaphor and more like someone trying to record what their eyes and skin experienced. A storm approaches, but not quite like weather. The word can mean storm, but it can also mean an army or a destructive force. The lament describes it descending from heaven, fire that touches roofs, an evil wind that carries harm in its breath, a residue that makes land unproductive, salt, salt again, salt that lingers beyond the day of destruction and turns the future bitter. And then there is another place, another record, not in wedges pressed into clay, but in ash pressed into earth. Let the museum hush fade for a moment, and picture yourself standing under open sky, northeast of the Dead Sea. The Jordan Valley stretches out in pale browns and faded greens. Heat shimmers over the plain like breath over a sleeping mouth. The air tastes of dust and sun-warmed stone. Somewhere far off, water moves, but you cannot see it yet, only sense it. Like a thought you have not finished. A dig site hums with careful motion. Brushes whisper, trowels scrape. People speak in low voices, the way you do when you are afraid of waking something. Tense, flap in a dry wind. Someone kneels at the edge of a trench and squares the earth with string, dividing chaos into neat geometry, as if order can be restored one line at a time. The place is called el-Hammam. You step closer, and you can feel how the ground holds heat like a secret. Each footfall makes a dull, sandy crunch, and the dust rises in thin curls that settle on your shoes, on your cuffs, on the back of your hand when you lift it to shade your eyes. The wind is not strong, just persistent, sliding over the plain and carrying the faint mineral breath of the Dead Sea. It brings a taste of salt to your lips, even before anyone mentions salt in the soil. Someone hands you a fragment, carefully, as if passing a sleeping bird. It is light in your palm, rough on one side, strangely smooth on the other. You turn it slowly, and the sun catches the glassy skin, a shimmer that feels out of place among the browns and tans of ordinary earth. You know that feeling when an everyday object suddenly becomes unsettling, not because it is loud, but because it is too quiet about what it has endured. It is like that, a small thing, patient, waiting for you to notice. It is a tell, a mound built from centuries of lives, layered and compressed. From a distance, it looks gentle, almost like a sleeping animal. Up close, you see cut walls, exposed rooms, streets that once held footsteps. You begin to imagine the city as it was, not as a myth, but as a living place. Mud brick walls catching morning light, a courtyard where grain is poured into baskets, the kernels clicking softly like rain, a merchant counting jars, counting days, assuming tomorrow will be like today. A city builds habits. Habits expect the future. And then, within the soil, there is a band that interrupts the story. A destruction layer, thick, dark, 1.5 meters of charcoal and ash, crushed brick mixed with melted pottery, roof clay that flowed, not simply fell, leaving drips where it cooled mid-motion. In some places, hollow channels where wooden beams once lay, as if the wood vanished too quickly to leave more than a memory. The first thing archaeologists often lift and show, with a kind of careful disbelief, is pottery. These shards are not behaving like ordinary shards. Their inner surfaces can look normal, rough, grainy, the honest texture of fired earth. Their outer surfaces can look smooth, glassy, bubbled, as if touched by heat that arrived too fast for the whole body to warm. A sharp boundary within millimeters, like a line drawn by an invisible hand. People have tried to recreate it in experiments. They heat pottery. They measure temperatures. Some tests suggest an intense thermal pulse, far beyond what Bronze Age kilns could provide. Whether the exact figure is 2,000 degrees C or something lower, the same puzzle remains. This kind of citywide effect is hard to explain with ordinary fire. The mud brick tells a similar story. In normal ruin, it crumbles. Here, in places, it looks as if it's slumped, twisted, glazed on the outside, while still porous within. And then there is salt, not a sprinkle, not the usual mineral taste of a dry land. The sediment itself holds unusually high concentrations in some samples, as if salt had been lofted into the air and then sifted down across the ruins. Fine grains that could slip into cracks in pottery, into pores in brick. A pale coating that would make soil stubborn, water harsh, crops reluctant. Salt does not shout. It seeps. It lingers. After the destruction, the valley grows quiet for a long time. Not just this city. In the wider area, other settlements show disruption and abandonment within a narrow window. There is an occupation gap that can stretch centuries. People move away. Footsteps thin. Fields go untended. The Jordan Valley becomes a place where wells taste wrong, where memory makes the landscape heavy. Now, breathe again, in and out. Let your jaw soften. Let your tongue rest. Let your eyelids feel heavier, as if they are curtains falling. You do not need to solve anything tonight. We can hold the mystery the way you hold a warm cup without spilling it, because the scientific story here is not a single straight line. It is a path with arguments and revisions, with claims that rise and then fall away, leaving certain facts still standing. Melted pottery remains. A thick destruction layer remains. A long abandonment remains. The question is, what caused the initial event? For a time, a team of researchers proposed an airburst, a cosmic explosion in the atmosphere like Tunguska, but over a populated valley. They looked for markers that could point to impact physics, especially something called shocked quartz, grains bearing microscopic fractures that can form under immense pressure. If true, it would be a kind of smoking gun. Other researchers challenged those identifications. They argued the features were not diagnostic, that some fractures could come from other stresses, that certain interpretations were too eager. Later, a key paper was retracted, not because the site stopped being strange, but because specific mineral claims could not be supported with enough rigor. That is an important kind of darkness too, isn't it? Not sensational darkness, the darkness of uncertainty. The way even careful people can disagree when they are staring at the same dust. And still, the ruins do not disappear. Tall el-Hammam stays where it is. The glassy surfaces remain glassy. The ash layer remains thick. The salt remains a stubborn whisper in the soil. So the mind does what minds have always done. It turns back to story. Genesis speaks of cities destroyed by fire from the heavens, smoke rising like smoke from a furnace. It is language that can be read many ways. Some say it is purely theological, a moral tale. Some say it may preserve a memory of a real catastrophe, dressed in the clothing of judgment. And there is the temptation to overlay maps, to ask whether this tell sits where one of the cities of the plain should be. Some scholars argue yes, others argue no, and offer different sites, different chronologies. It is debated. We cannot be sure. But the alignment of certain details is intriguing enough to keep people returning to the trench. The proximity to the Dead Sea, a body of water so salty it feels like a mineral heart. The mention of bitumen pits, making a region flammable. The lingering desolation, the way later writers used the name Sodom as shorthand for ruin. When you place those elements beside the Sumerian laments, another possibility quietly forms. Not a proof, a question. Could different cultures have preserved overlapping memories of catastrophic destruction, each describing it through their own frameworks? Or are these independent traditions, using similar imagery because humans reach for similar language when the sky turns strange? We will not force an answer. Tonight, we will do what the ancient scribes did. We will sit beside the record. We will listen. We will notice the details that refuse to be ordinary. Dust, clay, water, candlelight, a museum hush, a river's breath, deep time. Imagine, for a moment, the scribe again, back in Nippur. He rolls a ball of clay, flattens it, smooths it with the side of his palm. The clay is cool at first, then warms slightly under skin. He holds his stylus like a reed held for music. Tap, a wedge, tap, another. Outside the room, ordinary life continues. Donkeys bray, someone laughs. A child cries, then quiets. Life assumes it is permanent. The scribe does not. He is writing a lament, and laments are written by people who have learned that cities can be erased. His lines mention salt and storm and fire. They mention gods because that is the language he has for forces too large for a human hand. He presses the marks carefully, as if carefulness can keep the world from repeating itself. May this not happen again. Pressed softly into clay. And now, beside this fire, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, you can let the story settle in your body the way warm light settles in a dim room. For now, let the questions stay soft at the edges of your mind. Let them drift like smoke that never quite forms a shape. The fire can crackle once, then settle. Candlelight can blink. Your chest can rise and fall in a steady, unhurried rhythm. And the ancient world can keep its secrets for a little longer. The next part will take us deeper into the trench and deeper into the argument, letting each shard and each wedge mark glow for a moment before it fades back into hush. The fire in the room crackles once, softly, as if to keep time. Outside our imagined window, the night is wide. Inside this story, the day in the Jordan Valley is bright enough to make you squint. If you were standing there with me, at the edge of the excavation, you would notice the sound first. Not one sound, but layers. The scrape of a trowel, the whisper of a brush, a low murmur of voices that rise and fall like insects in summer. Somewhere a bottle cap clicks. Somewhere fabric snaps in a dry wind. And under it all, a silence that belongs to the buried city, patient and unreadable. Tall el-Hammam is what many call it now. A mound, a tell, a rounded shoulder of earth that looks almost gentle until you remember what it is made of. Centuries of lives, pressed down and built over and pressed down again. The upper city rises above the plain, a broad platform that once held walls thick enough to feel permanent. You can almost see it in your mind. The way mud brick walls catch the sun, the way a palace would have thrown shade across courtyards, the way footsteps would have echoed between shaded alleys and open courtyards. And then you look into the trench, and permanence looks different. There is a layer that stops the story abruptly. Not a slow thinning of pottery types, not a gradual change of architecture, not the gentle signal of people drifting away. A hard band of disruption, charcoal, ash, brick pulverized into powder, roof clay that seems to have flowed, not simply fallen, as if it softened and ran before it cooled again. The first thing they show you, often, is the pottery. You might think a broken pot is just a broken pot, a common thing. But here the shards are peculiar. On one side, the clay looks normal, rough, grainy, the color of baked earth. On the other side, the surface has gone smooth, glassy, bubbled, like something briefly turned liquid and then froze in surprise. The change can happen within a few millimeters, as if the heat touched the outside and never had time to travel inward. If you cradle one fragment in your palm, you can feel its weight, the coolness that comes after thousands of years, and you can imagine the moment when it was hot enough to change its nature. It makes your mind reach for comparisons. A kiln, a house fire, lightning, but nothing fits neatly, not when the same pattern appears again and again across an entire city's remains. The mud brick is strange too. These walls were not stone. This was a world built from clay and straw, sun-dried, stacked in orderly rectangles, strong enough for tall buildings if cared for. In ordinary destruction, mud brick crumbles, it powders, it erodes. Here, in places, it looks as if it's slumped, twisted lumps, surfaces glazed hard, while the interior stays porous. It carries the faint suggestion of something that once behaved almost like lava, even if no volcano stands nearby. And then there is the roof clay. Imagine a roof made with beams and packed earth, a practical solution in a land where wood is precious and stone is rare. In some collapsed rooms, archaeologists have found drips and hanging shapes. Little ceramic stalactites formed, where softened clay fell through gaps and cooled mid-motion. Hollow channels where wooden beams once were, as if the wood vanished too quickly to leave anything but a memory of its shape. The destruction layer is thick, 1.5 meters, the source says, a heavy blanket over streets and thresholds. When you stand at the trench edge, the layers read like pages. Above, the ordinary. Below, the sudden. And the human evidence, when it appears, is not the kind that lets your thoughts rest easily. Not complete skeletons laid out in careful burial, more like fragments, dispersed, as if the event did not allow bodies to remain whole, or did not allow the living to gather the dead. It is spoken of cautiously in reports, and I will speak of it gently here, enough to know that whatever happened, it happened fast. Too fast for goodbyes, too fast for gathering what you love and running. Some researchers have suggested the city's materials show signs of temperatures that seem beyond the technology of the Bronze Age. Numbers are offered, experiments described, and as you listen, you can feel the pull of certainty and the tug of doubt. That is the honest shape of this mystery. The melted surfaces are real. The ash layer is real. The abandonment that followed is real. What caused it? That is where the air turns foggy. Still, one detail keeps returning, like the refrain in the clay laments. Salt, not just a sprinkle, not the normal mineral taste of a dry land. The source speaks of samples with unusually high concentrations, as if salt had been thrown into the air and then sifted down across the ruins. If you close your eyes, you can imagine it. A wind carrying crystals so fine they feel like dust. A pale film settling onto hot surfaces, slipping into cracks, lodging in pores. A quiet contamination that would make soil stubborn, water harsh, crops reluctant. It would explain the silence that followed, because tall el-Hammam was not a small hamlet. It was a dominant place in its region, a city that would have controlled trade and fields and river access. You do not simply walk away from something like that unless the land itself tells you to, unless the ground feels wrong, unless the wells taste wrong, unless the memory of a single day makes the valley feel like a warning. After the destruction, there is a gap. Centuries in which settlements in the surrounding area thin out, vanish, or shift away. People find other hills, other plains, other water. The Jordan Valley becomes, for a long time, a place of reduced footsteps. As you stand there in imagination, you can almost feel the weight of that absence. Not dramatic, just empty. Wind in grass, a distant bird, dust settling into the angles of broken walls, the slow patience of time. And somewhere far away, in another land, scribes press their styluses into wet clay and write of cities that fall together, of fire that comes from above, of a storm that is not just weather, of land salted into hunger. Their words and this ash layer seem to look at one another across distance and centuries, not proving, not declaring, but whispering a possibility. In the next part, we will move closer to the argument that tried to name the mechanism, the impact markers, the tiny spheres, the claimed shocked quartz, the comparison to an airburst like Tunguska, immense energy with no crater. We will also move into the debate, the pushback, and what remains after certainty is taken away. For now, let the trench stay quiet. Let the melted pottery rest in your mind like a smooth stone warmed by sun, then cooled by night. Let your breath keep its slow rhythm, like the river's breath, steady, patient, moving onward, even when cities stop. Stay with the small motions. An archaeologist kneels at the edge of the layer and makes a square with string, dividing Earth into neat geometry. There is something comforting about grids, about the idea that even chaos can be measured. A notebook opens, numbers are written, a camera clicks, dust lifts with each breath, and then settles again, as if it is tired. The team has been working here for years, season after season. I picture their first mornings on site. Coffee in the cool dawn, jackets pulled tight before the heat arrives, the sun climbing, unhurried. Then the long hours of careful removal, millimeter by millimeter, until walls emerge, and streets, and rooms that have not been seen since the Middle Bronze Age. The city, as they describe it, was large for its world. Fortifications thick enough to feel permanent, a palace complex that suggests storage, administration, power. When you hear those facts spoken softly, it becomes easier to imagine the ordinary life inside them. A woman rolling dough in a shaded corner, dusting flour from her fingers. A child carrying a small jug, the water inside making a thin slosh. A rhythm against the jug's clay belly. A merchant counting jars, counting days until the next caravan. The city had time to build habits. That is what makes the abruptness so unsettling. Habits expect tomorrow. When the excavators found the destruction layer, it did not only surprise them, it reorganized their understanding of the site. The stack of time looked interrupted. Buildings did not slowly decay. In some places they seemed cut off mid-story, as if someone stopped the sentence halfway through and never returned to finish it. They take sediments from across the site, from palace areas to residential spaces, and carry them to laboratories where the light is cold and the instruments hum softly. Some claims are made about tiny spheres that can form when material is briefly heated to extremes and cools again. Other claims are debated. The details matter, and the debates can be sharp, but none of them erase the simple physical strangeness of what lies in the trench. The wider pattern is hard to ignore. The destruction is not only in one room, it is across the city. And it is not only in one city. Within a radius of roughly 25 kilometers, other settlements show disruptions in the same broad period, with an occupation gap that can stretch hundreds of years. Archaeologists call it a gap. If you imagine living through it, it is relocation, uncertainty, the slow work of finding water that tastes less bitter, soil that accepts seed again. The salt detail becomes more haunting when you think about how salt behaves. Salt does not shout. It seeps. It rides on wind. It lodges in pores. It makes clay reluctant, makes plants struggle, makes mouths thirsty. If the valley was once described as well-watered, then a sudden salting would feel like an inversion, like the land itself turning its back. You can imagine the aftermath without any harsh images, just through the small sensory changes. A well that tastes wrong, a field where sprouts rise and then yellow. People carrying water farther, walking longer, and each step stirring dust that carries memory. Stories form in those slow months after the event, not in the flash itself. In the aftermath, when people gather in whatever shelter remains and try to explain what happened with the vocabulary they have. That is why the ancient texts are so tempting to lay beside the archaeological layer. Both are records of aftermath, in their own way. Clay, tablets, and soil strata, both preserving what a single day can do to centuries of building. And there is another detail the excavators speak of, one that sounds almost like a direction written into the debris. Some fragments appear to have been flung in a consistent orientation, as if a wind moved through with force and decided which way things would fall. It suggests the city was not only burned, it was struck, pushed, forced to move. If you close your eyes, you can imagine a shockwave without seeing anything violent, just a sudden pressure change, like when a door slams in another room and you feel it in your chest, a pulse that moves through air faster than thought, a moment when walls forget they are walls, and then the silence returns. Years, decades, centuries. The mound becomes a quiet rise in the landscape. Wind moves dust from one side to the other. Plants grow, die, grow again. The ruins do not rebuild themselves. They simply become a place where the earth holds its breath. So let us take a breath together, in and out, because the next steps of the narrative will ask us to walk into contested ground, into how a theory of an airburst gains shape, why certain evidence is argued over, and how an old biblical scene, smoke rising like a furnace, might have sounded to someone watching from higher ground. For now, we remain by the trench edge, listening to the brush strokes, watching dust fall, watching the past become visible, one careful scrape at a time, and letting your breathing stay slow, steady, and safe. If you were to step down into the trench, carefully, you would feel the temperature change. The deeper layers hold coolness, protected from the sun. Your boots would press into compacted earth, The smell would shift too, from sun-dried dust to something older, mineral, like a sealed jar opened after years. You might reach out and touch a wall line, not with your bare hand perhaps, but with a gloved fingertip. The texture would be rough, then suddenly smooth, where heat once kissed it. That contrast is what keeps returning in this story. Ordinary clay, and then clay that has been altered into something that does not belong. It makes you whisper, without meaning to, what happened here? And the valley, wide and quiet, does not answer in words, it answers in layers. We left the museum's hush behind, and I can still feel that cool air in my lungs. But now, we are back in the open valley, where sunlight lays its hand on everything, patient and heavy. If you were standing here with me, you would notice how quickly your own senses adjust. The first minute feels harsh, bright, too honest. Then, slowly, your eyes learn the color of dust. Your ears learn the rhythm of a dig site, a brush whispering against soil, a trowel making a soft, gritty scrape, the faint snap of a measuring tape. Small calls between researchers, polite and controlled, like people speaking in a library that happens to be outdoors. Tall el-Hammam rises out of the plain as a long, low mound, as if the earth has been holding its breath for thousands of years. The upper city sits higher, catching more wind, and the lower town spreads around it like a faded skirt. You can feel the difference under your feet. Up on the tell, the soil is looser, full of broken brick and ancient crumbs. Down below, the ground is more compact, as if it has been pressed by many seasons of absence. There is a particular kind of silence that hangs over ruined cities. Not the silence of nothingness, but the silence of too much being compressed. Layers of kitchens and courtyards, layers of footsteps and arguments, and quiet laughter in the evenings when the air cooled and the day's heat finally let go. All of that life pressed into earth, and then covered, and then forgotten, and now coaxed back into light one careful centimeter at a time. The first thing you see in the trench is not drama, it is order. Strings stretched taut across squares, pegs, little flags, labels written in neat handwriting that will travel back to lab shelves and computer screens. There is something soothing about that, honestly. The way modern hands try to be gentle with ancient disaster. The way people kneel, slow their breath, and refuse to rush. In one square, a wall emerges. At first, it is only a faint line in the dirt, a change in texture. Then the line becomes the edge of a brick. Then the brick becomes a course, and the course becomes a face of a structure that once stood tall enough to cast shade. Mud brick is humble material, clay mixed with straw, shaped and dried beneath the sun. It builds cities quickly, it holds warmth, it smells faintly of earth, even after it hardens, but it is vulnerable. Rain can soften it, fire can crack it, time can crumble it into the same dust it rose from. And yet, in some places here, it does not look merely cracked. It looks altered. You pick up a small lump that should be crumbly, and you feel a hardness on its surface, a thin glaze as if the outer skin was briefly melted and then sealed. The inside remains light and porous. The outside feels like it has been kissed by a heat too fast to share itself evenly. Nearby, a tray holds pottery fragments, ordinary shapes, curves of jars, bits of rims. At first glance, they are what you would expect from any Bronze Age site. Then you tilt one in your hand, and the sun catches its outer face. Smooth, glassy, bubbled, a sheen, as if the clay tried to become something else, and then stopped halfway, startled. The inner surface can be rough and familiar, the honest grit of fired earth. The boundary between the two can be sharp, within a few millimeters. That boundary is part of what makes the mind slow down, because slow, steady fires usually heat things through. They blacken, they crack, they break. They do not often produce this quick, skin-deep transformation across a whole city. Researchers have tried to reproduce it. They heat fragments in controlled conditions. They measure changes in the clay's minerals. They compare. The exact temperatures and durations are debated, and the details can shift with new data. But the broad puzzle remains. Something here delivered intense heat very quickly. And then there is the destruction layer itself, the band that interrupts the city's long habit of living. 1.5 meters in some areas. Charcoal, ash, pulverized brick, melted roofing clay, sometimes shaped into thin drips as if it flowed for a heartbeat and then cooled mid-fall. In places, it forms little hanging shapes, like the stone teeth of caves, except made of baked earth. If you lean closer, you can smell the dust, that dry mineral smell that is not unpleasant, just old. And beneath it, if the wind is right, you can taste a faint salt on your lips, the valley's quiet signature. When the team began excavating, they expected ordinary patterns: collapse, rebuild, collapse again, the usual slow stacking of centuries. Instead, the stratigraphy ended abruptly, walls cut off, floors sealed under the same dark band, rooms that looked as if they were interrupted mid-use, as if the city did not have time to tidy up, or flee, or even understand. It is one thing to read that. It is another to stand over it, with a brush in your hand, and realize you are touching the edge of an ending. We have modern words for some of this: shockwave, thermal pulse, airburst, but words are gentle compared to the reality they point toward. Some researchers proposed that a cosmic body entered the atmosphere and exploded before reaching the ground, releasing energy above the city. Something like Tunguska, the 1908 explosion over Siberia that flattened forests while leaving no crater. In the Jordan Valley, the idea is that an airburst could send winds at terrifying speed and heat intense enough to melt surfaces and pressure strong enough to crush stone and brick. Modeling of an object tens of meters wide, moving faster than sound, can produce numbers that feel unreal. Winds near 1,000 kilometers per hour, heat spikes capable of altering materials in fractions of a second. One proposed signature was shocked quartz, mineral grains bearing microscopic features that can form only under extreme pressure, the kind delivered by impacts. This became a focal point. If the quartz was truly shocked, it would suggest a cosmic event. If not, other explanations might rise in importance. The trouble is that minerals can be tricky narrators. Under a microscope, lines and planes can look convincing, and later, under stricter criteria, they can lose their certainty. Some specialists argued the features did not match what impact science demands. They described the structures as pinching and swelling rather than staying uniform, as if normal geological stress or heat could have produced them. A paper presenting the airburst interpretation was published, and the story traveled fast because people are hungry for clear answers. Then the pushback came. Peer review continued after publication, as it often does. Critiques gathered, debates sharpened, and eventually a retraction followed, citing errors in methodology and interpretation. What remains, even after retraction, is not nothing. The melted pottery remains. The thick destruction layer remains. The abrupt end of occupation remains. The regional abandonment remains. So the question returns, softer, but no less persistent. What happened here? Some propose an earthquake along the Dead Sea Transform Fault. The region is seismically active. Earthquakes can topple walls, ignite fires, disrupt water systems. They can scatter people and end cities. But earthquakes do not easily explain glassy pottery skins across a wide area. They do not easily explain a city-wide thermal pulse that alters surfaces without cooking everything through. Some propose warfare. Bronze Age armies burned cities. They used fire as terror and tactic. But again, ordinary fire struggles to match the material transformations observed here, especially at scale. So the airburst remains in the conversation, even as specific mineral evidence is debated. It remains because it can unify multiple observations into one coherent event: sudden destruction, heat, wind, directional scattering, and a peculiar spread of salt. And salt, the quietest clue. When you sift soil through your fingers, you feel grains that are not just sand. Some samples show elevated salt content, sometimes very high. Salt that seems distributed, not simply left by slow evaporation. Salt that could have been lofted and settled. Salt that could have infiltrated cracks while materials were still warm. Some researchers suggested that if an explosion happened near the Dead Sea, it could have vaporized water and carried salt into the air, then let it fall back like pale dust across the valley. If so, the catastrophe would not end when the shockwave passed. It would continue in the soil, in the fields, in the taste of water, turning life difficult for generations. And the archaeological record does show a long gap. Settlements in the surrounding area are abandoned in a narrow window. The valley's population thins. The land becomes a place people avoid. You can feel that absence in your body when you stand here. It is not just theory. It is a sensation. Wide space, few trees, wind moving over emptiness. A sense that the land is holding a memory it does not know how to release. There is another detail the excavators speak about in low voices, as if volume itself could disturb the past. Direction. When fragments are plotted, when their scatter is mapped, patterns appear that feel almost like a fingerprint. Shards from the same vessel, found meters apart, aligned in a consistent orientation. Small pieces embedded where they do not belong, as if the air carried them like thrown stones. A general sweep, often described as moving from southwest toward northeast, like a brutal gust with purpose. It is one thing to say wind. It is another to stand in the trench and imagine a wind so fast that it becomes a wall. A wind that does not just push clothing or bend reeds, but turns pottery into projectiles and makes doors into flapping pages. The palace complex is part of this puzzle. Thick walls, engineered strength, the kind of building meant to tell a population that their rulers were permanent. Yet the collapse here seems sudden, compressive, as if the structure was not breached and then burned from within, but pressed down from above. Blocks that should be stacked lie jumbled. Spaces that should be open are filled with crushed debris, layered like a book slammed shut. And then, in some rooms, there are fragments of human presence, not clean skeletons laid gently by time, mostly pieces. It is difficult to speak about this without awakening fear, so I will keep it soft. Think of what happens when a powerful blast moves through a space. Joints do not hold. Bodies do not have time to become still in ordinary ways. The record becomes scattered. The human story is present, but not in the shape we wish for. It is one of the reasons the site feels so emotionally heavy to those who work it, even when they talk about minerals and temperatures. Under the science is grief, quiet and constant. And because the evidence is complex, the conversation becomes complex. A claim is made, a counterclaim follows. Methods are questioned. Definitions tighten. What counts as diagnostic? What counts as suggestive? At what point does an interpretation become too confident? This is where you can hear the difference between mystery and myth. Mystery invites careful hands. Myth invites quick certainty. The better scientists I have listened to, the ones who sound most trustworthy, tend to speak with a kind of calm restraint. They say, here is what we saw. Here is what we tested. Here is what remains open. They leave space for other possibilities, not out of weakness, but out of respect for the past's stubborn complexity. So, when a paper is published and later retracted, it can feel dramatic in headlines, but in the quiet rooms where research really happens, it is often more like a long exhale, a correction, a reminder that the earth does not care what we wish to prove, and still, The city remains ruined in the same way it was yesterday. The pottery remains glass-skinned. The layer remains thick and dark. The valley remains wide and windy, tasting faintly of salt when the afternoon heat pulls moisture from your skin. Now, let's slow down and let your breath match the pace of the brush, in and out. Listen to the soft scrape of metal against earth. Not loud, not sharp, just a steady, patient sound. Imagine the archaeologist's hand, the way it pauses before touching a fragile edge, the way it chooses gentleness over speed. Imagine a fragment lifted, turned, placed in a padded tray. Imagine the label written carefully, like a promise to remember. And imagine, too, the people of the city, who had no labels and no trays and no chance to preserve their own ending, except through the layers they left behind. In the next part, we will step beyond the trench and into the ancient words again, into the way different cultures tried to speak about fire from above, about smoke like a furnace, about 5 cities and 1 spared town, and the way memory travels, soft but stubborn, across deep time. Keep your breathing slow, the way a candle flame holds itself steady when the room is calm. Because now we are going to do something that feels simple and yet always changes the way a story tastes. We are going to place 2 kinds of evidence side by side and let them look at each other in silence. On one side, the ground, ash, brick, salt, glassy pottery skins, the long abandonment of a valley. On the other, the words, not modern words, not laboratory language, but ancient phrases shaped by hands that did not know our vocabulary and yet tried to be precise anyway. If you were standing with me, we would step away from the trench for a moment and sit in the shade of a canvas awning. The fabric snaps gently in the wind. Someone pours water into a cup, and you can hear the thin stream. A few drops splash onto the earth and vanish almost instantly. The heat drinks them. Your skin feels warm. Your throat is dry. Your mind starts doing what minds do in old landscapes. It wanders toward the stories attached to place. The Jordan Valley has always been heavy with story. The biblical account in Genesis describes a cluster of cities in a plain near the Dead Sea, a region said to be fertile and well-watered before disaster, and then described as a place of ruin afterward. Sodom and Gomorrah are named, along with other cities of the plain. The text says, "Fire and sulfur rained down from the heavens." It says, "Smoke rose like smoke from a furnace." You can read that as theology, as moral narrative, as myth, and you can also read it as a human attempt to describe something catastrophic, witnessed from a distance, and then repeated and shaped across generations. Scholars debate how literally the geography should be taken, and proposed locations vary. Tall el-Hammam is one candidate some point to because of its size and position in the northern Jordan Valley, while other sites have also been suggested. And then there is the strange detail that always returns, like a quiet footstep behind you, the pillar of salt. Lot's wife looks back, and she becomes a pillar of salt. The image is stark and oddly specific. Many interpret it symbolically, a warning against hesitation, a lesson about obedience, a transformation that speaks in moral language. Some have wondered whether the salt detail echoes the local landscape and the way a catastrophe can leave a taste that becomes symbol. Genesis describes smoke rising like smoke from a furnace. If you were a distant observer watching a sudden destruction in the valley, what would you see? A dense column, a dark plume, a horizon that becomes bruised by ash. Even without modern knowledge, you would look and say, something has burned in a way that feels different from ordinary fire. The text also describes a cluster of cities, not just one, and one nearby place of refuge, Zoar, that is spared. The idea of a concentrated zone of destruction with surrounding areas less affected fits some disaster scenarios better than others. Airbursts, for instance, can produce highly localized devastation depending on altitude and angle. But it can also be explained by other factors: wind direction, fuel sources, the way fire moves through structures, the way memory compresses complex events into a "it is debated," and still, people keep trying. Now, let us shift our attention, gently, thousands of miles to the east, to the cities along the rivers of Mesopotamia, where writing first pressed itself into clay. Because the Sumerian records that people bring into this conversation are not a single tablet that says, plainly, "This happened there." It is not that tidy. Instead, there are lament texts, compositions mourning the fall of cities, like Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash. They are full of imagery that can be read as ritual and poetry, and yet they contain details that make modern readers pause. They speak of gods abandoning temples, leaving them cold. They speak of a storm that is not just weather. They speak of fire that comes from above. They speak of an evil wind and a residue that harms the land. They speak of people scattered, of streets emptied, of the sound of grief traveling through doorways. And there is that feeling, the one I mentioned earlier, when a text stops sounding like a metaphor and starts sounding like trauma. It is important to be honest about the gaps. The standard scholarly dating places the composition of many of these laments around 2000 BCE, and the destruction at el-Hammam is often placed around 1650 BCE. That does not align neatly. It does not allow a simple statement like, "The Sumerians wrote about Sodom." Some scholars argue the laments memorialize older catastrophes, that the writing date does not equal the event date, that oral memory could preserve descriptions long before they were written. Others argue that similar language appears because cultures share motifs, and destruction poetry tends to reuse certain images: storm, fire, darkness, abandonment. It is debated, but there are thematic echoes that persist, and the human mind is tuned to echoes. In the lament tradition, a city is described as having its step of joy scorched like an oven, a detail that sounds domestic and therefore intimate. The destruction is not just of walls, but of everyday routines. A roof that once held shade becomes the first place to catch fire. A courtyard that once held water becomes a place of ash. The laments speak of a force descending from heaven, and the word used for storm can also mean army, a destructive presence that arrives with intent, whether literal or poetic. There is also the Babylonian text, known as the Era Epic, where a god associated with war and plague and fire unleashes destructive implements. Some modern retellings get very specific, naming cities and describing effects in ways that feel almost too close to our own fears. Mainstream scholars tend to caution against reading modern technology into ancient terms. Words like tool or weapon do not necessarily imply anything beyond conventional instruments of war in ancient imagination. The imagery of blinding light and poisonous wind can live inside religion without requiring machines, and still, the idea that the ancients tried to catalog the qualities of destruction remains compelling. 7 weapons, an evil wind, a residue that harms growth, the sense that the disaster is comprehensive, not like a normal siege where victors take livestock and treasure, the sense that the force was indifferent to value, indifferent to survival. This is where the story begins to hover between history and interpretation, like a moth near a flame. It wants warmth. It risks burning. So we stay gentle. We return again and again to what we can touch: clay, dust, salt, the long silence of an abandoned valley, and the simple fact that humans preserve catastrophe in story when they cannot preserve anything else. Imagine a Sumerian scribe at a desk in a temple school. The clay tablet is damp and cool. His stylus presses marks that are both art and record. Behind him, students murmur. Outside, a river moves. The world feels stable, because people always feel that, right up until it is not. He writes a lament, And the lament is grief shaped into patterns so it can be remembered, lines that can be recited, images that will survive the collapse of buildings. This is one of the strange mercies of clay. Fire can destroy a city, and yet fire can bake a tablet, making it last longer. In the Jordan Valley, fire may have turned pottery skins to glass. In Mesopotamia, fire may have preserved words in clay. And between those two facts, the mind finds a quiet bridge. I have always found it strange, in the best way, how a landscape can become a kind of library, not shelves and paper, but ridges and basins, not ink, but salt crust and charcoal. And then, when humans arrive, we bring our own libraries with us, the ones made of words, and we try to match them to the land like two halves of an old puzzle. The story of Sodom carries moral weight in later tradition, used as shorthand for desolation, invoked by prophets and teachers when warning about consequences. That is part of how trauma travels, too. It becomes lesson. It becomes symbol. It becomes a name people use when they want to describe a place beyond recovery. The Sumerian laments traveled differently. They were grief more than warning. They mourned cities as if the city itself had a soul. They spoke of temples emptied, streets silenced, gods withdrawing like light leaving a room. And because students copied them, the laments became durable. A civilization teaching its children how to write by teaching them how to remember loss. Now, about the more controversial interpretations. Some modern writers have tried to read these ancient texts as literal technical reports, while mainstream scholars strongly caution against that approach, pointing out translation and context problems. And yet, even if we set aside the more sensational claims, the discomfort remains. These texts are intensely interested in destruction that feels larger than ordinary human war. They emphasize forces from above. They emphasize the abandonment of the land. They emphasize that something happened so overwhelming that humans could not frame it as a normal victory by an enemy army. So, we arrive at a quiet crossroads. Either these are conventional motifs used to dramatize catastrophe and reinforce theological ideas, or they are cultural memory preserving the sensory qualities of a real event translated through the only language available: gods, storms, decrees, and winds that carry harm. Both possibilities can coexist in the same story. That is what makes ancient literature so difficult and so beautiful. It is not a clean window. It is stained glass. Light passes through, but it is colored. If you let your mind soften, you can hold both views without strain. You can let the archaeologist in you touch the pottery and say, something delivered intense heat. You can let the listener in you hear the ancient phrases and say, people tried to describe what they could not control. And you can let the human in you feel the shared vulnerability underneath it all. Because at the heart of this story is not a debate about mechanisms. It is the simple, heavy fact that thriving places can vanish, and that those who come afterward will spend centuries trying to understand why. In the next part, we will stay with that vulnerability, and we will follow the thread of memory forward. How survivors might have moved away from the valley, how the names of ruined cities became symbols, how later generations used those symbols as warnings, and how, above all, the earth kept breathing beneath the ruins, patient, waiting for us to listen. Night returns in my mind, the way it always does after a day in the trench. You can spend hours in sunlight, studying ash and brick, and still, when evening comes, the story turns inward. The air cools. The valley's heat loosens its grip. Dust settles into the folds of your clothes. Candlelight feels kinder than any lamp, and you begin to wonder about the people who did not get to step away from the ruins, not because they were brave or careless, but because there was no time. I want to handle this gently. So imagine the catastrophe only as a sudden change in the sky, a brightness that arrives too fast to name. A soundless moment when the world seems to pause. Then a force, like a door slammed by a giant hand, rushing through streets and rooms. Not everyone was inside the city when it happened. That simple fact can feel like mercy and like cruelty at once. A merchant on the road, a herder guiding animals along a slope, a traveler sleeping in a shallow cave out of the wind, a woman gathering reeds near water, her hands wet, her mind half on the day's ordinary tasks, a child chasing a small lizard along a stone wall, laughing quietly, then stopping, sensing something in the air. We do not have their names. We have their absence. Later, in the layers, we have the sudden ending of household life. We have the long gap in settlement, the way the valley seems to empty itself and stay empty, as if the land itself asked to be left alone. Some archaeologists talk about this in the language of demographics and occupation phases. Others, when you catch them after a long day, speak more softly. They say things like, the survivors must have gone somewhere. They say, you do not lose a city and simply vanish. The people reappear in other places, hidden in pottery styles, in new villages, in the sudden swelling of settlements in safer hills. It is a tender kind of detective work, following refugees through fragments. Imagine, then, that you are one of the ones who was away. The first sign is not flames. It is wind that does not feel like wind. It feels like pressure. The hairs on your arms lift. Your ears pop. Even animals stop and stare. A moment later, the horizon changes. Smoke? Yes, but not the thin smoke of cooking fires. This is heavy, dense, rising with a stubborn force, like a column that insists on being seen. It spreads across the valley, staining the sky. It carries a smell that your body recognizes as danger, even if your mind cannot explain it. A bitter tang, a mineral bite, something that reminds you of burned clay and wet stone dried too quickly. If you run toward it, you run into silence. Not the peaceful silence of evening, but a silence where the usual sounds are missing. No birds, no goats bleating from courtyards, no human calling from gates. The air itself feels wrong, drier, sharper. It scratches your throat, and then you see it. Walls that were there yesterday, now collapsed into a confused slope. Roof beams gone, leaving hollows like dark ribs. Pottery shards glittering in the dust, catching the light in a way that pottery should not. A strange glassy sheen, like the world tried to turn to crystal for a heartbeat. You would call out. No answer. You would step carefully, because every step changes what remains. Your sandals kick ash. Your breath brings the taste of salt into your mouth. You rub your lips and feel a faint grit. You blink, and your eyes sting, as if the air is carrying something it does not usually carry. This is where the story becomes the beginning of another story, because after catastrophe, there is survival. And survival is not heroic in the way songs like to pretend. It is mostly small decisions made while exhausted. Where do you go when your city becomes a forbidden place? The hills to the west, across the Jordan, toward places where water still tastes like water, toward kin, toward any hearth that is still lit. You travel with what you can carry, which is never what you want. The weight of a jar, the softness of a blanket, a small clay figurine that fits in your palm, a tool, a ring, a child's hand in yours. The road is dusty, and dust is a kind of time you can breathe. You stop at night. You build a small fire, careful, because the memory of flame is fresh and too loud in your mind. You eat what you can. You sleep in pieces. You wake often, listening to the wind, checking the sky, as if the sky has become untrustworthy. Some nights, you would hear other people on the same road, quiet voices, shared water, a brief exchange of news, each telling a version that is both identical and different. It was fire from above. It was a storm. It was the gods. It was a sign. It was a punishment. It was an accident. It was an enemy's secret weapon. It was the earth itself turning against us. Each person reaches for the frame that makes the fear manageable. Each person shapes it into language, because language is the only shelter that can travel. Later, much later, those frames harden into tradition. In one tradition, the destruction becomes judgment. It becomes a story about wickedness and warning, and the choice to flee without looking back. The valley becomes a symbol of what happens when a line is crossed. In another tradition, the destruction becomes grief. It becomes lament. A city mourned as if it were a beloved person. A temple described as cold. A god described as having left. Not because the god is weak, but because humans need a reason for why protection failed. Both traditions preserve the same emotional truth. Something happened that broke the ordinary world, and then there is the land itself, keeping its own account. Salt changes everything, quietly. A field can look normal and yet fail. Seeds can go into the ground and come up thin, if they come up at all. Water can taste a little bitter and still be water, yet your body begins to dislike it. Animals drink and refuse to drink again. People get headaches, lips crack, skin becomes raw in the dry wind. You try to wash, and the water leaves a tight feeling behind. This is how a catastrophe can persist for generations without another explosion. It becomes an environment. Archaeologists speak about soil salinity, about percentages, about how salt affects agriculture. They can measure it, map it, compare it. But for the people living through it, it would have felt like a curse with no visible hands. A slow, quiet punishment that does not end when the smoke clears. So the valley empties, not instantly, not in a single day, but steadily, as families decide that stubbornness is not the same as courage. They leave farms behind. They leave walls behind. They stop repairing wells. They stop planting in the places that no longer respond. Years pass, then decades, then centuries. The ruins soften. Wind pushes dust into corners. Rain, when it comes, carries fine silt and lays it down like a blanket. Plants return in small ways, hardy and cautious. The tell becomes a mound. People pass by and point and say, "A city was there once." They do not settle. They do not build over it. The story attached to the place grows heavier than any stone. This long emptiness is sometimes called a gap, as if it were a missing line in a book. But it was not nothing. It was a dark age of a particular valley, a time when the most important thing was not walls and trade routes, but simple survival elsewhere, and the steady telling of a story so it would not be lost. You know that feeling when you keep repeating an event in your mind, not because you enjoy it, but because you are afraid it will slip away and become unreal? That is what cultural memory can be, a community repeating a catastrophe until it becomes a structure, as solid as a temple, as durable as clay. In the quiet of evening, I can almost hear those repetitions. A parent telling a child, "Do not go there." An elder saying, "Our people once lived by the river, but the river became bitter." A traveler saying, "There is a mound in the valley, and the air tastes strange when the wind comes from the Dead Sea." And then, across far distance, another scribe, another city, another civilization, writing its own laments for cities destroyed by storm and fire, speaking of residue and evil wind, not because they visited this valley, but because humans everywhere learn that cities can vanish, and they want to keep the fact of that in words. When the night deepens, it becomes easy to feel small beneath the sky. That is not a bad feeling. It can be calming, if you let it. The sky above the Jordan Valley is wide. Stars appear one by one. A thin crescent moon hangs like a quiet promise. And somewhere in a temple school far away, a student presses a stylus into clay, learning to make marks that will outlast fire. Picture the crossing itself. The Jordan is not always wide, but it is always alive. Even when it looks still, It carries a slow muscle underneath, pulling reeds, turning little leaves in circles, dragging the memory of mountains toward the Dead Sea. At dusk, the surface reflects a bruised sky. In the shallows, pebbles shine as if polished by a patient hand. You step down the bank and the mud takes you at the ankle. Your foot slides, then steadies. Water rises cool around your skin, and for a moment, the world becomes simple again. Water is water, and you are a body moving through it. Your clothes darken. Your bundle sits higher on your shoulder. You smell damp earth and crushed plants. On the far bank, you kneel and squeeze water from your sleeve. The cloth makes a soft sound, like a sigh. You touch the ground with your fingertips, the way tired travelers do when they want reassurance. Less bitterness here, enough to make you trust it, so you go on, toward hills where lamps still burn. And you carry the story. Later, it will be told in the tones people use when they are trying to keep fear from spreading. Certain details will stay because details anchor memory. The glass on pottery, the way roofs burned first, the salt that drifted like dry snow, the silence after. Not every detail will be true. Some will be guessed. Some will be shaped by priests and teachers, because priests and teachers do what they think will help people live with chaos. Still, the core will persist. A thriving place was erased in a breath. This is why I always linger on the quiet technology of memory. Clay, a handful of mud, pressed and smoothed, becomes a page that can survive a fire. Honestly, I have always found it strange and beautiful that the same substance used to build fragile walls could also hold words that last longer than empires. In Mesopotamia, scribes learned in rooms that smelled of damp earth and smoke. They sat close to small lamps. They held a stylus steady and practiced wedge marks again and again, the way you might practice a lullaby until it becomes muscle. A teacher drifted behind them, sandals whispering, offering small corrections, never hurried. A student would breathe out and try again. And little by little, a simple phrase would appear. A city, a temple, a storm. Not the power to stop disaster, but the power to refuse disappearance. This is what I mean when I say the laments are grief pressed into clay. The kind of grief that sits in the body and makes you move slower, that makes you listen harder to footsteps in the night. If you were standing here with me, beside the fire, you might hear that careful listening in the way the tablets were kept, in temple libraries, in boxes, on shelves, protected from rain, protected from careless hands. Students copying older compositions, line by line, honoring them. Not fully understanding, perhaps, but sensing that these words mattered because someone wanted the future to remember the taste of ash, the way a sky can become too bright, the way farmland can turn bitter. And now, thousands of years later, those tablets sit behind glass in museum hush. You lean close. You see the wedge marks. You see a thumbprint in the edge, a tiny accident of touch. You imagine candle smoke in the scribe's room. You imagine river breath outside a city wall. You imagine numbers shrinking on a ledger as trade collapses, as fields fail, as people leave. The past does not shout, it whispers. And in the next part, we will follow that whisper into the rooms where texts were copied, debated, doubted, and turned into legend, while the old valley remains quiet under the stars, waiting for us to look closer. In the next part, we will sit beside those students for a while. We will listen to how texts are copied, how stories travel through generations, and how the urge to explain catastrophe becomes a kind of sacred work, not to frighten us, but to remind us that memory is a soft lantern in very old darkness. Stay with the warmth of the fire for a moment. Let your shoulders drop, just a little. Let your tongue rest in your mouth, as if it has nothing urgent to do. If your jaw is tight, unclench it softly. One breath in, and a longer breath out. Good, because now we move into a place where the mind likes to argue. and arguing can be bright and sharp. Tonight, we will keep it dim and gentle. In the modern world, the ruins do not speak on their own. People speak for them. Some speak with careful caution. Some speak with hunger for certainty. Some speak with the kind of excitement that comes from being near a mystery. At el-Hammam, the evidence that everyone agrees on is already strange enough. A thick destruction layer, charcoal and ash, mud brick that looks as if it's softened, pottery with surfaces that turned glassy, a city that was thriving, then suddenly not. A region that stayed mostly empty for a long time afterward. Even if you never mention a meteor, even if you never mention angels or gods, you still have a puzzle sitting in the dust. So scientists and scholars gather around it like people around a quiet well, trying to see what is at the bottom. Some researchers proposed that the cause was an airburst, not an impact into the ground, not a crater, but an explosion in the atmosphere. A fragment of rock or ice coming in fast, heating, breaking apart, releasing energy high above the city. A pulse of heat, a shock wave, a wind so strong it becomes a wall. It is a plausible mechanism. It has happened in modern times in places like Siberia, where forests were flattened without a crater. The idea is not impossible, and when those researchers looked at the melted surfaces and the pattern of destruction, they said, "This fits." Their models suggested temperatures that could briefly exceed what Bronze Age fires could reach, and winds that could push debris in a consistent direction. Still, science is a slow creature. It does not like to be rushed into a neat conclusion. Other scientists examined the same claims and said, wait. They focused on the most diagnostic markers, the ones that would make a cosmic event nearly certain. Things like shocked quartz, those microscopic patterns in mineral grains that can form under sudden, intense pressure. This is where debates become sharp. One group says the features look like shock. Another group says they do not match the strict criteria, that they pinch and swell, that they can be explained by other stresses, by heat, by tectonic strain, by ordinary geology doing extraordinary things over time. You can feel the tension in their papers, in their careful footnotes, in the way one sentence can carry a whole argument without raising its voice. And then, in time, the most prominent publication connected to the airburst hypothesis was retracted, not because the ruins vanished, not because the melted pottery stopped being melted, but because some parts of the mineral analysis were judged methodologically unsound. Retraction is a hard word. It sounds like erasure, but it is not that. It is more like a human admission. We cannot support this claim with the certainty we thought we could. It is a correction, not a spell that turns the site back into an ordinary ruin. What remains is what you can still touch, the layer, the glassy surfaces, the abandoned centuries. So the story becomes quieter and more honest. Something catastrophic happened, and we are still trying to name it. That openness, that refusal to pretend certainty, is one of the most comforting things I know about real research. It means there is room to breathe. Some scholars propose earthquakes because the region sits on a fault and the earth has a long history of moving there. Earthquakes can topple walls, fracture buildings, and trigger fires. They can change water courses. They can turn a stable life into an unsteady one overnight. But earthquakes do not easily explain brief pulses of extreme heat across a whole city. They do not easily explain the peculiar way pottery appears to have been heated on the outside and not all the way through. They do not easily explain directional patterns that resemble a blast. Others propose warfare. Ancient armies burned cities. They used fire as a tool. They toppled gates. They robbed granaries. They scattered populations. Yet the same problem returns, gently, like a refrain. The temperatures seem too high, the transformation too abrupt, so the airburst stays in the conversation, even after criticism, even after retraction. because it can hold more of the evidence in one explanation than other theories can. But it is not alone in the conversation. Because tall el-Hammam sits in a landscape of older stories. The Dead Sea lies nearby, heavy with salt, a dark mirror where the wind sometimes smells metallic. To the west rise hills that can become a lookout. To the east, high ground that can see far. And in one old text, there is a description of smoke rising from a valley, like smoke from a furnace. If you have ever stood at an archaeological site and then read a line like that, you know the strange feeling it can create. The past seems to lean toward you. The words feel less like myth, more like a memory that found a way to survive. Still, it is debated. Some archaeologists argue that Tall el-Hammam is too far north to be the Sodom of tradition. Others argue that earlier sites farther south were destroyed by fire and that the names may have drifted. Some argue that the biblical narrative was compiled long after the events, that its geography is as much theology as map. All fair, and yet other scholars point out how specific some details are. A vantage point in the hills, sight lines into the valley, a fertile plain described before its ruin, a region known for bitumen pits, a cluster of cities close enough to fall together. When you lay maps over texts, you can make yourself dizzy. You can also learn humility. We are trying to line up memories separated by centuries. We should expect drift. We should expect overlap. What matters is that the core pattern appears in more than one tradition. Multiple cities, sudden destruction, fire from above, aftermath that leaves the land changed. This is where the Sumerian laments enter again, like distant singing. City laments are not like heroic epics. They are sorrowful, repetitive, full of the quiet insistence that what was lost mattered. They describe temples abandoned, gods departing, streets empty. They also describe storms that feel like armies, destructive forces that come from above, winds that carry particles, residue that makes land unproductive. Some scholars read these as conventional literary motifs, a way of speaking about conquest and collapse using the language of gods. Other readers, especially outside academia, feel something more literal in them, as if they are hearing eyewitness attempts to describe an unfamiliar disaster. We cannot be sure. We can say the laments preserve trauma. We can say they preserve a feeling. We can say they preserve some technical sounding details that are intriguing. We should also say, softly, that intrigue is not proof. This is where the modern imagination, hungry and restless, sometimes leaps. There is a controversial interpretation, popularized by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, that frames the Anunnaki not as gods in a poetic sense, but as physical beings, factions, politics, and weapons beyond Bronze Age understanding. In that reading, words like tool and weapon become literal devices, and descriptions of blinding light or poisonous wind become modern war, translated backwards through ancient language. Mainstream Assyriologists reject this strongly. They point to mistranslations, to misunderstanding of grammar, to the way ancient texts used metaphor and theology as their natural mode. They point out that the archaeological sites in question do not show radioactive signatures that would be expected from nuclear weapons. And it is worth hearing that rejection, because it reminds us how easily we can force the past to wear the mask of our present fears. Still, it is also worth noticing why such ideas persist. Because there really are places where heat did something strange. Because there really are ruins where destruction is abrupt. Because humans dislike not knowing. When evidence is incomplete, stories rush to fill the gap. That is not a failure of imagination. It is a natural human reflex. But it can lead us away from what we can actually ground in the earth. So tonight, we will keep our feet on the dust. We will say, the melted pottery is real. The thick destruction layer is real. The centuries of reduced settlement are real. The rest is interpretation. and interpretation should be handled with calm hands. If you feel your mind getting too active here, that is normal. Let your breath slow again. Let your eyelids grow heavy if they want to. You do not need to solve the mystery to rest. There is another layer to this conversation, a wide one, spread across cultures. Stories of fire from the sky appear everywhere. The Greeks spoke of Phaethon, losing control of the sun's chariot, scorching the earth until a god struck him down. In India, ancient epics describe divine weapons that blaze and roar, leaving survivors sickened, leaving land altered. In many places, people tell of cities swallowed by flame, or drowned by sudden water, or buried in ash. Some of these are likely metaphors. Some may be memories of actual disasters. Some may be both at once. Humans share patterns. We watch lightning and meteors and volcanic sunsets, and we make meaning. A meteor, bright as day, can cross the sky in silence and change a village's stories for 1,000 years. A strange wind after an eruption can turn a season into famine, and famine can become a myth about gods. So when we see a line about fire from heaven, we should not grab it with both hands and declare certainty. We should cradle it. We should ask what it might be describing and what it might be trying to teach. There is also the rhythm of catastrophe in the archaeological record. Civilizations collapse, trade networks thin, cities shrink, numbers on ledgers grow smaller. The early Bronze Age ends. The late Bronze Age ends. People scatter. They rebuild. They forget. They remember. Some researchers have wondered whether cosmic events contribute to this rhythm, whether periodic airbursts or impacts might have punctuated human history more often than we like to think. There are meteor streams our planet passes through each year, debris fields from long broken comets. Most pieces are dust, a few are stones. It is debated how much risk those streams pose, how often a damaging object might intersect with a populated place. Statistics suggest that large airbursts are rare, but not impossible. Many occur over oceans or empty regions. The horror in our story is not that such events happen, but that occasionally, by chance, they happen over a city. Tall el-Hammam, if the airburst hypothesis is correct, could be one of those terrible intersections. A city in the wrong place, under the wrong sky. And if the airburst hypothesis is not correct, then we are left with a different kind of discomfort. That some process we do not yet fully understand can imitate the effects of extreme heat and sudden destruction. Either way, the lesson remains soft and steady. Civilization is fragile, not doomed, not hopeless, just fragile, like pottery before it is fired, like wet clay before it is set. That fragility is not meant to scare you tonight. It is meant to calm you in an odd way, because it means your small life, your quiet choices, your evenings and breath and ordinary kindness are part of what holds the world together. And it means the ancient scribes were right to write. They could not prevent the storm. They could not stop the fire, but they could preserve memory, so future minds could be gentler, wiser, more awake to the sky. Imagine the museum at closing time. Lights dim slightly. Footsteps become fewer, softer. A guard's keys make a small metallic chime. Somewhere, a vent hums like a distant river. The air smells faintly of stone and old paper, and that particular clean scent of glass that has been wiped again and again. You stand before the case. Your own face is a shadow on the surface. Behind it, the tablet rests, small enough to fit in 2 hands, heavy enough to change your posture. The clay is not smooth. It is pitted, baked, cracked in tiny ways, and yet the wedge marks are sharp like a whisper preserved in a hard shell. You do not need to read Sumerian to feel it. A person sat somewhere with a lamp and pressed these marks one by one. They paused. They breathed. They continued. And now, the room around you is quiet enough. that you can almost hear that patient rhythm in your own chest. In the next part, we will return to one last quiet scene: a tablet, a museum case, a catalog number, and the strange intimacy of reading marks made by a hand that has been dust for 4,000 years. And we will let that intimacy lull us toward sleep. The glass case is colder than you expect. Not cold like winter, not sharp, just cool, as if the museum keeps its breath, measured and even. When you lean closer, your own reflection floats over the tablet for a moment, and then slips away when you shift your head, leaving only clay and the small, disciplined wedges cut into its surface. Catalog numbers sound like they should be sterile, a sequence of letters and digits, a label that keeps emotion out. Yet I have always found it strange that a catalog number can become a doorway, because once you know it, you can call a particular object back into the world again and again, like a name whispered at the edge of sleep. CBS2204, a tablet once pressed in a room that smelled of damp clay and lamp smoke, now resting in a quiet gallery far from the river valleys that raised it. It came from Nippur, from a temple library, from shelves that once held thousands of fragile voices. You can picture the place if you let yourself slow down. Thick walls of mud brick, a courtyard where dust drifted in thin sheets, students carrying lumps of clay in both hands, careful not to drop them, careful not to smear the surface before the marks were made. If you were standing here with me, you might notice how the museum hush changes your body. The shoulders settle, the jaw loosens, your steps become smaller, as if the floor itself deserves gentleness. Even your thoughts move differently, less like sprinting and more like walking along a riverbank. The tablet does not scream its story. It holds it, a lament, a composition written to mourn cities as if they were beloved relatives. Not one city, but many. Names that once rang in marketplaces and temple courts, now reduced to syllables on clay. The refrain returns like a tide. The gods departed. The temples grew cold. The storm came. Fire followed. The land was left changed. It is easy to read that and think poetry, metaphor, religious language. And it is also easy, after a day spent looking at vitrified surfaces and broken walls, to feel a subtle discomfort, the sense that the ancient writers were describing something they did not know how to name, using the nearest words available: storm, weapon, wind, dust, salt. Some scholars argue that these laments are a genre shaped by politics, a way of processing conquest, the fall of dynasties, the trauma of invasion. They point out that ancient cities were often destroyed by armies, that fire and starvation were familiar companions in those centuries. They remind us that gods in these texts behave the way gods always behave in Mesopotamian literature, debating, abandoning, returning, explaining human suffering through divine decisions. Other scholars look at certain lines and pause. They notice the emphasis on suddenness, the suggestion that usual weapons of siege were not the cause. The way the destruction is framed as coming from above, not from the city gates. The mention of residue that makes land unproductive. The eerie precision of an image like roofs catching first, as if embers were raining down. We cannot be sure what those details refer to. We can only admit they exist, and that they tug at modern imagination. And the modern imagination, when it tugs hard enough, produces stories of its own. There is a particular path the mind takes when it sees an old text and an old ruin and wants a single neat explanation. It reaches for one cause that can cover everything, and it prefers causes that feel dramatic, because drama is easier to remember. This is how the idea of an ancient nuclear war found its audience. If you have ever watched someone discover that idea for the first time, you will recognize the look. Eyes bright, a quick inhale, the thrill of believing that the past is hiding something forbidden. The name that often follows is Zecharia Sitchin, a writer who argued that the Anunnaki were not merely gods in the poetic sense, but physical beings with factions and conflicts, and that ancient texts preserve literal accounts of advanced weapons. Mainstream scholars reject his interpretations. They point out mistranslations, grammatical misunderstandings, the way he reads modern technology into ancient words that simply do not carry those meanings in their original context. They also point to the absence of the kind of physical evidence we would expect from nuclear detonations. Still, the idea persists because it offers a kind of frightening clarity. It is the same impulse that makes people draw straight lines between stories of divine weapons in distant cultures, as if every myth must refer to the same event. Sometimes there are connections. Sometimes there are shared human patterns. Sometimes there is only the mind's hunger for one answer. Tonight, we can let that hunger soften. We can say, gently, that the past is allowed to remain complicated. The airburst hypothesis, for example, is not a myth. It is a scientific proposal based on physical clues. It has been argued for and argued against. It has been published and then partially withdrawn, not because the ruins vanished, but because certain mineral identifications were contested. It is a reminder that research is a living thing, adjusting its posture as new critiques arrive. What remains is the material in the ground, melted surfaces that imply extreme heat for a brief moment, a destruction layer thick enough to feel like a single breath of time spread into a meter of ash and broken brick, salts that appear in places they should not, concentrated enough to change the soil's behavior, a pattern of abandonment across a region, as if something made people decide that staying was no longer a choice. All of that is real. And then there is Genesis, another form of clay, pressed into memory instead of earth, a story of a valley that was once fertile, a story of smoke rising like a furnace, a story of a command not to look back. Whether you take it as theology, as moral lesson, as history, or as a mixture, the line that stays with you is the same, a sudden ending remembered for a very long time. When you hold the Sumerian lament and the biblical accounts side by side, you feel a quiet tension. Two traditions, different gods, different frameworks, both circling the same shape in the dark. Fire from above, multiple cities, land that becomes bitter, survivors who flee. It could be coincidence. It could be shared motifs. It could be overlapping memories of different disasters that humans naturally compare. Or it could be that one catastrophe echoed far enough to enter more than one cultural stream. We do not need to decide tonight. We only need to notice how humans respond when something breaks. World. They tell the story. They repeat it until it becomes part of the way children learn caution, part of the way elders interpret suffering, part of the way a landscape is named. They carve it into clay, into parchment, into ritual recitation. They place it in a temple library. They copy it in a school. They carry it across exile. They keep it alive until someone else, centuries later, leans close to a case in a quiet museum and feels a shiver of recognition. Honestly, that persistence is the most human thing in the whole tale, and it is why the catastrophe does not end at the moment of destruction. It continues in the long after. In the Jordan Valley, the after might have been a bitter wind, soil that refused seed, wells that tasted wrong, memories that made people avoid certain mounds at dusk. In Mesopotamia, the after might have been a city lament, recited by students who never saw the original ruins, but inherited the grief anyway. In later Israelite tradition, the after becomes prophecy, warning, a symbol invoked whenever writers want to describe desolation. The same mechanism, different languages. Memory turning into structure. There is one more kind of after, quieter than all of these. It is the way a discovery in modern times changes the rhythm of our own minds. An archaeologist brushes dust from a wall. A lab technician holds a shard under a microscope, and sees a surface that once flowed. A geologist runs a sample and finds salts where they did not expect them. A historian reads a line about a storm descending from heaven and suddenly wonders what kind of storm could do that. And in that wondering, the past becomes close. You can feel it as a gentle pressure behind the eyes. In some corners of the internet, that closeness turns into certainty too fast. In other corners of academia, closeness is held at arm's length, carefully, to avoid being seduced by a good story. The best work, in my view, happens somewhere between, close enough to listen, far enough to doubt yourself. So, as we sit beside this small clay tablet, let us keep both qualities. Listen and doubt. Let the mystery be a soft thing, not a sharp one. Before we leave, let me linger on the marks themselves, because they are smaller than you imagine. Each wedge was pressed with a reed stylus, not drawn. A pressure, a release. Pressure, release. The scribe had to keep the surface moist enough to receive the sign, but not so wet that it slumped. And between lines, he angled the tablet toward the lamp, so the fresh impressions caught the light. You can almost hear it, the faint tap of reed against clay, and then the quiet scrape as the stylus lifts away. There is tenderness in that, even when the content is grief. Another tablet, from another collection, carries another number, IM 75680. It is often mentioned in popular retellings, sometimes spoken of as if it holds the neat answer everyone wants. 5 cities, fire, a list, a clear map, but even there, we have to move slowly. Fragments break, lines are missing. Translators disagree about a single sign, and a single sign can tilt a sentence from place name to metaphor. We cannot always tell whether a scribe is describing one event or layering several disasters into a shared poetic form. Even the word often translated as weapon can mean implement, tool, an object used to do a job. Language, like clay, carries fingerprints. And then there is the way the divine enters the text, the assembly of gods, the Anunnaki. For an ancient listener, this can be a way of saying, this was beyond us. This was not a neighbor's raid. It arrived from outside our control, from above, from the space where only the sky and the gods are allowed to live. I have always thought this is where ancient writing and modern science almost touch, not in sensational leaps, but in the shared admission of limits. We do not know. If you want, take a slow breath here. Imagine the museum hush settling around your ears, the cool floor under your feet, the smell of stone and faint wax. The tablet stays in its case, unmoving, yet the mind moves back and forth in time, feeling for texture, learning to hold uncertainty without panic. Out there, beyond the museum walls, the night does not care whether we call something divine or cosmic. The sky is simply the sky. Dark velvet, sometimes hazed with city light, sometimes clean and sharp enough to make you feel the depth between stars. And yet, for people in the Bronze Age, that depth was not empty. It was crowded with intention, a realm where decisions could be made without warning, where a flash could split the ordinary day into before and after. You can imagine a traveler on a ridge above the Jordan Valley, long before our calendars began, sand under his sandals, a faint ribbon of river sound below, the Jordan breathing through reeds, the Dead Sea somewhere beyond, heavy and still, holding its salt like a secret. The traveler looks up. He sees the same constellations we see, only without names we recognize. He watches meteors stitch quick lines across the dark. He does not know which streak is harmless, which stone will burn out, which one will. And that is the quiet dread inside the old stories. Not the monsters, not the curses, not even the moral judgments. It is the feeling that the world can change in a heartbeat, and that the change can arrive from a direction no guard can defend. When I say that out loud, I feel my own body want to tense. So I soften it again, shoulders down, tongue resting gently. A slower breath, because fear is not useful here. Awareness is enough. The scribes knew that too, I think. They did not write to frighten their students. They wrote to place a marker on the edge of memory. Here is what happened. Here is what it felt like. Here is what remained. And now, when you are ready, we will move from the tablet back out under the sky, not to chase fear, but to notice how the same sky that once frightened Bronze Age cities still drifts above our own roofs, quiet, indifferent, full of stones and ice and dust, and how our only lasting defense is the same one the scribes chose: to remember, to write, to bear witness. In the next part, we will follow that thread into the modern night, into the way we track objects above us, into the uneasy comfort of statistics, and into the ancient plea that seems to rise from every disaster story, whether carved in clay or told beside a fire. May this not happen again. There are nights when the modern world feels very far away. Even the idea of satellites and catalogs and radar, all of it can feel like a thin, bright layer over something older and darker. Yet it is real. We do track objects above us. We give them numbers the way museums give tablets numbers. We measure their angles. We calculate their paths. We build lists that try to turn uncertainty into a manageable shape. If you have ever looked at one of those lists, you know how calm the language is. Diameter, velocity, close approach date, probability, risk corridor. It is the kind of calm that reminds me of the cuneiform tablet, honestly. A refusal to let emotion distort the marks. And still, behind the calm, the same truth hums. Above the roofs of every city, there is motion. Sometimes it is a harmless spark. Sometimes it is a stone that never reaches the ground. Sometimes it is ice and dust from a broken comet, spread into a stream the Earth passes through twice a year, leaving us to wonder whether history's sudden collapses could ever repeat in a pattern we do not yet fully understand. Some researchers talk about cycles. Others caution that the mind is too eager to see patterns in chaos. Both may be right in different ways. What we can say, gently, is that catastrophic events do happen. A Tunguska-class airburst flattened forest in 1908 and left no crater, only silence and bent trees. That is not myth. That is memory on paper, in photographs, in eyewitness accounts, in the slow recovery of taiga. It shows us a mechanism, a way the sky can strike without touching the earth. And so, when archaeologists look at tall el-Hammam and see a city abruptly ended, they are not reaching into superstition. They are reaching into the set of known possibilities, trying to match clue to cause. Even if one paper is challenged, even if certain minerals are reinterpreted, the core puzzle remains. Why this heat so fast? Why these walls so flattened? Why these shards glazed like tears? Why the salt scattered as if the Dead Sea itself had briefly turned into mist? A story is allowed to have open questions. That does not make it weaker. It makes it honest. So tonight, let us hold the open questions the way you might hold a warm cup in both hands. Not tight, not desperate, just present. Because the larger story, the one that matters most for sleep, is not the argument. It is the human response. After catastrophe, people become wanderers. They step away from ruined streets and try to find water elsewhere. They carry small objects wrapped in cloth. A tool, a cup, a child's toy, a scrap of cloth that still smells faintly like home. And there is another kind of survival that does not leave a wall or a pot behind. Oral memory. It sounds fragile, a story carried in breath, but it can be stubborn. A tale repeated at the same festivals, in the same rhythms, with the same key images, becomes a structure in the mind. Each generation learns it the way you learn a song, not by reading, but by listening, until the shape is familiar enough to hold. Sometimes details drift, names shift, moral meanings grow around the core like vines. Still, a surprising amount can remain stable, especially when the event being remembered was so abrupt that it divided time into before and after. People remember those seams. They teach them. They warn with them. That is why, centuries later, a Hebrew scribe could inherit the image of smoke like a furnace, and a Mesopotamian student could inherit the refrain of gods departing, and both could be carrying a memory older than either text. When writing finally enters, the memory changes form, but it does not lose its pulse. A tablet can be copied. A parchment can be recopied. Errors appear. Yes. Debates grow. Yes. Yet the act of copying is itself a ritual of care. Imagine a scribe late at night, lamp low, reed pen scratching, pausing to sharpen the tip, pausing to wipe a smudge, pausing to listen for footsteps in the corridor. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, the past stays awake on the page. And in our own time, the ritual continues in different clothes. A technician watches a screen. A line of numbers scrolls. A telescope catches a point of light moving against the stars. Someone assigns it a designation, and the designation becomes a modern catalog number, a way of saying, "We have seen you. We are paying attention." It is not perfect protection. It is simply witness. Sometimes witness is the only thing humans can do, and yet it matters, because witness keeps panic from becoming superstition, and keeps superstition from becoming silence. It turns dread into curiosity, and curiosity, when it is slow, can become calm. They cross the river, perhaps. They climb into hill country. They settle where the soil is kinder. They build again, not as high, not as confident. They teach their children the names of places that are now only mounds. They teach them the caution, too. Do not go there at dusk. Do not drink from that bitter well. Do not look back when the sky is wrong. In time, those instructions become story. In time, story becomes scripture, or poetry, or a lament recited in a schoolroom where young hands are learning the weight of a stylus. And the landscape itself becomes a kind of text, a tell rising from the plain like a slow wave of earth, dust collecting in its creases, wild grass catching along its slopes, wind combing it day after day, indifferent, patient. If you stand on such a mound, you can feel how deep time is. The layers are stacked like breaths. Each layer was once a present tense. Each layer held laughter, arguments, footsteps, the clatter of pottery, the smell of bread. Then one layer holds ash, and after that, a long, quiet gap where almost no one came. That gap is its own kind of evidence, not of how something happened, but of how it felt to live with the aftermath. People avoided the place. They let it be empty. They let it sit under the sun and the stars until the memory softened enough for humans to return. When they returned, they did what humans always do. They named the place again. They added new walls. They created new daily routines. They tried to turn the strange past into something that could be held without shaking. And still, somewhere in a library, the lament remained. A student in old Babylonian times, perhaps, presses the reed into clay and copies the old lines, even if he does not fully understand them. His teacher corrects the angle of a wedge. The student tries again. The clay accepts the marks. The mark holds. This is what survives. Not the fire itself, not the shock wave, not the exact chemistry of the salt, or the true height of an airburst, or the precise year on our uncertain calendars. What survives is the decision to remember. Near the end of one lament, there is a feeling that the writers are speaking past their own era, as if they know someone else will someday read. They shape the grief into words that can travel, and in that shaping, there is a small plea, a simple wish, almost like a prayer whispered into the clay before it dries. May this not happen again. It is a strange sentence, Because it recognizes two things at once. It recognizes that what happened was beyond them, and it recognizes that memory might be a kind of shield, not a physical shield, not a wall strong enough to stop a stone from the sky, but a shield against forgetting, against repeating mistakes, against the human tendency to imagine that the present is stable because it is familiar. In our time, we build different shields: telescopes, surveys, modeling, emergency protocols. We do our best, the way scribes did their best with reed and clay, and still, there is comfort in knowing that the impulse is the same. We watch the sky, we try to understand, we tell the story. So, if you are lying down right now, let the story do what it was always meant to do in a quiet voice beside a fire. If you were seated here with me, you would see the fireplace do its slow work. Not dramatic flames, just patient ones. A small tongue of orange rises, folds back into itself, leaving a faint whisper of heat on the air. The candle beside us leans slightly, as if listening. Its smoke is a thin thread that curls and then disappears, and the room holds that scent of wax and old wood that makes the mind soften. So let us return, one last time, to the scene that has haunted so many readers. A ridge above the valley. Abraham, in the older telling, stands at a distance. Smoke rises in a way that makes the landscape look like it is exhaling. The text compares it to a furnace, and that comparison matters, because a furnace is a place where heat is contained and made fierce, where air is forced, where something is transformed whether it wishes to be or not. From far away, you would not see details. You would see light, and then smoke, and then the dreadful quiet afterward. And in the nearer telling, there is Lot, a man urged to leave, a warning not to hesitate, a command not to look back. People read that command as moral instruction, and it can be. It can also be practical advice from someone afraid of flying debris, of heat, of a storm that comes from above. We do not know, and that is allowed. Then there is the detail that refuses to fade, a pillar of salt. Some scholars argue it is symbolic, salt as barrenness and regret. Others wonder if it reflects the landscape itself, the Dead Sea region dotted with salt formations that can look, at dusk, almost like figures. And of course there are those who imagine a more literal edge of the event, a moment when heat and salt-laden air met a human body at the wrong angle. Again, we cannot be sure. What we can be sure of is that salt changes soil, changes water, changes the willingness of people to believe a place is safe. When archaeologists speak of centuries with little settlement, it sounds academic, but for those who lived near the edge of that gap, it would have felt like a silence with weight. Roads quieter, fields reluctant, wells tasting wrong. This is how curses are born, even when there is no magic involved. A real environmental change becomes story, and story becomes boundary. In Mesopotamia, the same boundary was drawn as lament, a way of saying what was full became empty, what was loud became quiet. The gods left, the writers say, because that is how they explained abandonment. I find that explanation almost gentle, not because loss is gentle, but because it makes the world feel less random. The scribes were trying to live with the unbearable question of why, and underneath every answer, one quiet lesson returns. Civilization depends on conditions. Sweet water, soil that accepts seed, a sky that behaves. When those conditions change, even briefly, the world can tilt. That is why people wrote and copied and told the story again. And here, in this room, with the candle and the fire, we can let that remembering become soft again. Not anxious vigilance, just quiet respect for how wide the world is and how long memory can be. Because memory, when it is gentle, does not keep you awake. It helps you sleep. Let the room be dim. Let the breath be slow. Let the night be wide enough to hold every old story without making it sharp. One more slow breath, and another. The tablet rests. The ruins rest. The arguments rest. Only the gentle act of remembering remains, like a low flame that does not burn, only glows. Good night.